Well, welcome to Partners in Ministry. I'm your host, Dan Smith, and today I'll be joined by Lyle Miller. Lyle is a stewardship consultant for Everence Financial. Welcome, Lyle, and thanks for joining me today.
Thank you, Dan. It's always good to have conversation.
Hey, for folks who may not be familiar with Everence, can you tell us a little bit about your organization?
Sure. We are I sometimes describe it as being a full service financial service organization, but really at the heart of what we're doing is trying to help people connect their faith and values with the decisions that they make about money. We believe that everything that we have comes from God and is owned by God. And so as disciples, we're called to manage those resources well. And so very much at the heart of what we're trying to do is to help people make that connection between how it is that I manage my money on a day-to-day basis and how that connects with the faith that I live out in a daily basis. And so that happens through investment services, retirement services, insurance services, charitable planning kinds of things, banking services, and really even just, comprehensive looks at a person's financial life.
Sure. I know part of Everence mission is helping people plan with financial planning. And a common thing that people probably talk to you about is retirement. For those who are listening in that maybe be at the latter part of their working careers, what are some of the questions that they should be asking now?
Sure. Thoughts about planning for retirement. The reality is that can create anxiety for a lot of people. And we could spend a lot of time digging into the weeds of all of the questions that come down to it. But really, when it comes down to it, I like to go back to my college journalism class and consider what we used to call the 5 W's and the H question, the who, where, when, what, why, how kinds of things. And I think that asking questions related to those can really be sort of a helpful framework to thinking about the different aspects of retirement planning, because each one of those questions then has some that leads us into particular parts of that aspect of our retirement planning.
Sure. Well, let's jump right in and let's start talking about that. The 5 W's and the 1 H. Let's start with who.
Sure. So who has to do with thinking about who am I as I get ready for retirement and who is going to be affected by the decisions that we're going to be making. So, for example, we have things like gender. Women tend to live a little bit longer than men. If we're married, if we're single, that'll have different implications. And we often maybe start by thinking about, who are we, but it's also important to think about who are the others that would be affected by our decisions. So, for example, if we're in that sandwich generation that we talk about, what does it mean if perhaps a part of our retirement could include caring for aging parents? Or what does it mean, if we want to be closer to children or grandchildren along the way? So it's not just about me and my spouse if I'm married, but there may also be other people involved in our lives that we want to give consideration to. As we're thinking about the decisions that we need to make. Who are the other people that will be affected by my decision to retire or to continue working or what I do in retirement, et cetera?
That's a really good point. Retirement doesn't just jettison you from your personal, professional, and social networks. It just changes the way that you interact with them. So that's really a great place to start.
Exactly.
That would bring up the what. So what?
Yeah. So next question has, when we think about what, there's the what will we do in retirement? Is retirement about spending time with family and friends? Is retirement about traveling? Is retirement about maybe even continuing to work? Maybe it's not a complete transition from full-time employment. Maybe we continue working part-time. Maybe we consider volunteering a part of our time. One of my colleagues sometimes refers to there being 3 stages of retirement for many people. There's the go stage of retirement where we're very active, we're visiting friends and family, we're doing a lot of traveling and so forth. Then there's sometimes the slow go stage of retirement, which is where maybe we're not able to be as active, but we're still generally in good health and things like that. And then sometimes there's the no-go stage of retirement where maybe health keeps us from doing things. But each one of those stages will have different financial and other implications behind them because, the while our financial resources vary from person to person, the reality is that our time resources are very consistent. We each have 168 hours in our week, right? 24 hours in our day. And so what we do with those 168 hours a week will make a significant difference in how we can go about planning for retirement. Again, with this some combination of transitioning maybe from full-time work to volunteer work, part-time work, spending time with others that are important to us, traveling to see them, et cetera, those kinds of things.
Yeah. I know my two brothers both are retired from the corporate world, but they spent a couple years as a consultant. And they still talk
Exactly.
about how fun that was to kind of just ease their way out, but be able to get involved in all the real fun part without all the responsibilities of doing coaching and some of that other stuff. So there are
Exactly.
some really great
Yeah.
opportunities in retirement that come along as a result. So
Indeed. Yeah.
well, then obviously, one of the biggest questions is when should this all happen? I mean, the timing on this is really, really important. So let's talk a little bit about when.
Yeah. So when we can think of that in a couple of different ways. One of them has to do with the age part of it, right? I mean, there's a number of different markers along the way that are often important for people. 59, and when we reach age 59 and a half, that's the point where we can start to withdraw money from retirement accounts without any kind of penalty. 62 is the age when we can start to receive partial Social Security benefits. There's another, 65 is when we can transition into Medicare as an insurance option for many people. If you're thinking about retiring before age 65, that insurance question is one of the tricky things. There's an age when we can start to receive full benefits for folks in that age has been shifting over time. Now we're approaching the age where we can start to say that that's 67 for everyone. Age 70 and a half or age 70 is when we can maximize our Social Security benefits. 70 and a half is when we can start using a particular generosity tool. And a little bit later is when we're required to start taking money out of our retirement account. So there's all these chronological markers along the way that we want to take into account because they'll have financial implications. But there's also when questions as it relates to when do we want to retire in relation to our age. Maybe our family has a history of health challenges. And so, we might want to retire early knowing that we were, not dealt a good genealogical card or so to speak, in terms of our health. Or there's the question of if we're married, when do we want to retire in relation to our spouse? I remember speaking with a friend who said, for us, it's really important that my spouse and I don't retire at the same time. Doesn't matter which one of us does first. We just can't do it at the same time. And others might say, no, we definitely do want to retire at the same time. So there's lots of when questions that aren't just as simple as saying, okay, age 67 is when I get full retirement benefits. So that's going to be my decision. There's a lot of other variables that can go alongside that question of when.
Yeah. It sounds like all these W's kind of speak into one another. And so it becomes a larger conversation. It's not just a simple, I think I'll wait till I'm 70.
Exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that takes us now to the where question.
Yeah. So where also has significant implications because a lot of people think of their retirement, the where of retirement in different ways. It might be, I made a reference to travel, for example. That's one aspect of where. But there can also be things like, where do I want to live in retirement? Do I want to spend a portion of the year in a different community than where I'm at right now? If I'm living in the north, do I want to spend some of my winter months in a warmer climate? Flip side, I suppose, if you're living in the south, do you want to, travel north during the summer and avoid some of the heat or whatever? But do we want to move to be closer to children who are living in another community? Whether that's because we want to be close to attend all of our grandchildren's events, or whether it's because from a health standpoint, we recognize that as we age, we might want to be closer to our kids for them to be able to provide assistance with us in those kinds of things. There's also the where in terms of where do we want to live? Do we want to downsize our house, for example, so that we no longer have as much, outside responsibilities with our yard and things like that? Do we have interest in moving to a retirement community at some point in our lives? Do we want to stay in our current home as long as possible? And each of those has their own pros and cons behind that. Physically, there may be advantages to moving to a retirement home and not having to deal with the outside maintenance and the upkeep of our home, those kinds of things. But we also may be very attached to our community, our neighbors, and we want to stay engaged with them as long as possible. So lots of where questions also come into to play along the way as we're making those decisions, and each of those is going to have financial implications behind it for you.
Sure. Well, that leaves our final W at why. Why retire?
Yeah, and in many ways, it would make sense to actually have that be the first question that we ask, because why, why do we want to retire? What is it about retirement that's important to us? Because really that gets to the core of who we are and what we want to do, how we feel called to live out God's mission in our lives. And so the why question really intersects with a lot of those other questions that we've asked. Why might be because we do want to be closer to our family. Why might be because we want to take on a new challenge in life. We often talk about it really being important to think about what it is that not just think about what is it that we're retiring from, but also what is it that we are retiring to. The notion of just taking life easy. I don't think that's what God calls us to do. It's just to sit and do nothing and so forth. I think we're called to continue living out our life's purpose in retirement. And so what is it that is going to give me energy? What is it that's going to give me life in those retirement years, which for many people, could easily be a third of our lifetime or more, right? If we think about retiring in our mid 60s and the life expectancy at that point has many of us living into our 90s, that's a substantial chunk of our lives. And so why do we want to make this significant transition in our life? Because for many of us, once we get past the point of deciding, maybe where we're going to work or where we're going to live or who we're going to be married to or something like that at an earlier point in life, this notion of retirement for many of us is the single biggest decision that we're going to make. And so it's really important to think about the why behind this. Why do I want to transition from a working career, for example, that may have been very life-giving in its own, or it may have been very life-draining. And so, what are those next steps? How do we think about those? And why do we want to make that transition into the next step of life?
Well, we've hit the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, and why. That just leaves one left, and that's the how of retirement.
Yeah, and that's really where sort of the rubber meets the road, right? Where how do we go about doing the things that we need to do, making the decisions that we need to make? How do we bring in the resources of other people? Because these aren't decisions that we that we necessarily want to make just by ourselves, because all of these other kinds of questions that we're asking, they intersect with each other. And so how do we go about doing that? One of the things that we would certainly encourage is bringing in outside experts, bringing in people who really care and are concerned about helping you make that next step in transition. And so for us, at Everence, for example, this is a very significant time. Points of transition are oftentimes when it can be helpful to look for professional expertise and guidance, et cetera. And as I said, retirement is one of those significant points of transition. And so, we have many people that will reach out to us, for example, to say, okay, we're thinking about retirement. What do we need to think about with insurance? What do we need to think about? Do we have enough? Because really, almost all the questions that we work with when we're working with people, they very often kind of come back to this point of, am I going to be okay? Right? Am I going to be prepared for the next stage of life? And so, we just want to encourage people to have a trusted advisor. If there is specifically in the financial area, for example, if you have a person that you're working with, wonderful. If you feel good about that relationship that you're working with them and they bring the expertise, they have an understanding of what's important to you and all those kinds of things, wonderful. If you're not in that position, if you don't have a resource in that way, we certainly would be glad to have a conversation and walk alongside of you as you think about how can we align our resources with our personal mission and our desire with how to be faithful. How do we align those two in such a way that we have the confidence to feel enabled really to give of our time and our talents and our resources to the missions, the ministries, the organization, the life-giving activities that we're a part of? How do we bring those two together? And so again, the how part is often about, doing the research, both for yourself, but also then maybe drawing in the resources of others who can help walk alongside of you in that, and that can also, I should also say, that's bringing in the expertise of those in your faith community or those in your family that are important to you to help you think about these things. Asking lots of questions and drawing on the wisdom and the insights of others is really significant.
Sure. I know over the last several years that the foundation has been working with Everence. They've been a tremendous help because a lot of times you ask questions I never even thought about thinking about, just because you kind of live it on a day-to-day basis. So if you're like me, I've probably got about 15, 20 questions I'm going to have to talk with you about after this thing is over.
Sure, indeed.
Yeah, and if that's you, that's why we put the contact information for both Lyle and Everence on the screen. Please use that. It also can be found in the show notes for this episode on our website, or you can find it in the YouTube description as well. So, Lyle, thank you so much for this conversation. It's just been great.
Thank you. Thank you again. As I said earlier, it's always wonderful to have these kinds of conversations as we and to think about how we can work together, because really that's what life is about, right? Is working together as disciples in how do we carry out God's mission in the world and so forth. So thank you.
Yeah, and it's also a conversation. It's not one and done.
Exactly.
There are going to be questions that you address now, and then a year from now, 2 years from now, there's going to be some more. And so it's an ongoing relationship and not just a transactional process. Yeah. So on behalf of Everence, Lyle Miller, and Partners in Ministry, I just want to thank you for joining us today. And until next time, let's get out there and serve as Christ serves.